this time with a focus on the linkages between administrative and business practice. I am Carlos Tapia. I work at Tecnalia Research and Innovation, which is an applied research and technology organization based in Spain. I am participating together with my colleague Pierre, Menger, and Marco Bianchi in this project, in this network. And our session will illustrate some interesting examples of how innovation can contribute to achieve sustainable development goals, with examples from two countries, Ghana and South Africa, basically. But furthermore, this session will also allow to visualize the linkages between administration and businesses that we were talking about before, especially those that focus specifically on the economic systems, those that we want to transform from linear to circular models. All these issues will be exemplified by the examples that will be made by the panelists today, which I sincerely thank for being here. In particular, if I can say that to Nathan, who came all along from Canada, and not only from Canada, but from the West Coast to be here today. So I am really happy to have him here today. And Nathan will basically talk about mining, the implementation of small-scale mining laws in Ghana. Our second panelist, Lauren Basson from GreenCape Initiative, will showcase some examples on public and private partnerships around circular economy transitions or innovations. Finally, Malcolm Whitehouse from E-WASA will describe the South African experiences with electronic waste management policies in general. So I leave the floor now to Nathan Andrews, and I would ask each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves a bit further if they are willing to do so. So thank you.
All right. So thank you, Carlos, for this introduction, and thank you for coming. I know it's past lunch and people are tired, but thanks for staying. I would just highlight just briefly before I get into the presentation that my research and part of my work, doing a little bit of consulting, deals with the international political economy of resource extraction in the context of Africa. But then focus has been on Ghana. That's where I'm from originally, actually. And I look at other African countries, but in terms of field work where I get to talk to different stakeholders, I've been to Ghana for the most part. And so that's what the presentation is focused on. But I think small-scale mining is widespread enough across the context of Africa that I think some of what I'm going to say about Africa, about Ghana in particular, would be applicable in some parts of the continent. And so I think we could use that to create some linkages with what's happening elsewhere. So that's just by way of brief introduction. And so my presentation will focus mainly on the implementation challenges when it comes to small-scale mining laws and what that means for innovation, for sustainable development, and for people's livelihoods, because people are dependent on this kind of activity for their day-to-day lives. And so I would get right into the presentation. So I'll just give a brief history of artisanal and small-scale mining in the context of Ghana. It has gold mining in particular. So when I talk about Ghana, my focus here is on gold, because Ghana is known for different minerals, but I think gold is the predominant mineral. And it's, Ghana is actually the second largest gold producer in Africa after South Africa. So it's quite important to the national economy. So gold has been a fundamental part of the economy for many generations. And history tells us that local inhabitants, which for now we call them artisanal, small-scale mining. I mean, they used to be miners way before the colonial powers really got into the country. And I think that's if you know the context of Ghana, if you know the history, that's why the country was known as the Gold Coast, because it was known to have lots of gold, which was just scattered around the ocean and all over the place, and so it was just easy to find gold, and not so much these days with so much extraction going on in the country. The relationship, though, between artisanal miners and large-scale miners, even in those historical times, were quite antagonistic, because on the one hand, artisanal miners felt they had the sort of natural entitlement to the land, more so because most of these tracts of land were not entitled to a particular individual, so they are mainly communal-based land ownership that was in place, and still is in place for the most part, and so that has created quite a huge amount of conflict between large-scale miners and artisanal miners till date. And so even in that time, 1900, there was a concessions ordinance that was supposed to sort of recognize the role of chiefs and how chiefs had authority over the land, because as I said, communal ownership was what was practiced and is still predominantly practiced. And so this ordinance was supposed to help deal with the conflicts that existed at the time between these two different groups of miners. So in terms of regulation, even though there's a long history of mining, there wasn't much regulation of this type of artisanal activity until the 1980s, late 1980s, when there was a promulgation of the Small Scale Mining Act. And so this act came with two other regulations. One was to look at mercury and how mercury can be used effectively. So, you know, this particular mercury law allowed small-scale miners to have access to mercury, which is a fundamental aspect of fundamental element used to get the gold from the dirt, right? So I'll in brief moment, I'll show pictures and stuff of how this whole process works. And then there was also the Precious Minerals Marketing Corporation Law, which allowed the PMMC, which is now the company, official government company that buys the gold from artisanal miners, so that there is not much black market sale of gold going on. So this entity buys the gold from artisanal miners, some of whom are considered illegal, but this entity is still supposed to engage with them and buy the gold from them so they can get it to the global market. What happened with this particular law, the small-scale mining law, was that it broke down artisanal miners into two main parts, and that's where the problem began. Where on the one hand, they had those that are considered legal and regularized, and then on the other hand, they had those that were not regularized. So those that didn't really sign on to anything, they were just doing their own thing in the local areas. And so those are the ones that I'm going to focus the presentation primarily on. And that kind of category of miners is called galamsey. So I will be using the term galamsey from now on. And galamsey actually has different names in different parts of Africa. In South Africa, it's called zamazama. And some parts of Africa, they call them ghetto boys. And there are many names. So all of these reflect the sort of informal nature of this activity that they engage in. So one of the main issues with artisanal mining in general, even both legal and illegal activities, is that there is this known poverty trap that the miners find themselves in. And this is basically as a result of a number of factors. As you can see from this little figure here, it tells you, first of all, I mean, these activities dwell on unskilled labor, right? So as a result of the nature of labor that they use, and the inability of these local miners to actually invest more into labor, into technology, they go into this cycle where they have low technology, and as such, they don't have high prospecting goals, and so they really don't get much out of the portion of land that they would use. So they would probably have to use a lot of land to be able to get a small amount of gold to make a living. So that really has an impact on the environment. It has an impact on their own lives, even though they see themselves to be engaged in some useful venture. So that's one of the challenges, and that's why they call it poverty trap. So there's this whole network of factors that have a role to play when it comes to why artisanal miners are still predominantly marginalized in the African context. So I had a few videos that I wanted to show. There wouldn't be time for that, but if there is time towards the end, maybe I will show some of them. But basically, these videos were supposed to indicate how artisanal mining operates in different parts of Africa. And this is just a few. If you go to YouTube, you'll find a ton of them in almost every single country where there is artisanal mining. And the essence of this was to show how the poverty traps really works in the context and how people rely on this sort of activity, yet still they don't really have a sustainable livelihood based on this activity in the long term. And there are a number of reasons for that. The relevance of the sector basically is that it is noted that over 1 million Ghanaians directly participate in this sector, and about 4.4 million are dependent on it for their basic livelihood. And so 4.4 million would imply husbands and wives of people that are engaged in this activity, children, and all the people in that sort of economy at the local level, informal economy at the local level who are dependent. I mean, this is quite significant numbers for a population overall of 28 million thereabout for the country. So in terms of percentages, I think this is also useful to note that it contributes about 34% of Ghana's gold production, at least in 2014. Now I think it's even higher than the 2014 estimate. So it gives you an idea. Globally, the World Bank estimates that about 13 million people in 30 countries work in the ASM sector, and about 80 to 100 million people are dependent on it for their livelihood. So this is also significant at the global level. So it's not just happening in one little context of the world. One thing to say is that as a result of all of these figures and factors, I think the government of Ghana is now beginning to see a real potential for prioritizing the ASM sector as one of the ways to create some economy at the local level, but also for developmental opportunity broadly at the national level. All right, so despite the relevance, I mean, there are environmental costs, and please pardon me for these photos. I think they are quite blurry now that I'm showing them on a very large screen. But this one was to show how the activity works, and it's very bright actually on my screen here. But basically, it's very low labor and I mean low technology, and so basically most of these activities are done with machetes and very axes and very rudimentary types of tools. And so they dig through to as low as possible to find something. And so this is just an example of how they have dug through a particular portion to go look for gold. And one of the environmental costs is the death toll that really happens as a result of collapsed mine shafts. And if because some of these areas are really built on clay, so with all this digging, natural individuals digging through, these pits easily collapse. And every year you have at least one or two deaths that are reported. I'm sure there are several that are not really reported, but there's a lot that happens in these areas for people that are part of it. The other cost has to do with its impact on the environment, and particularly water pollution. What happens with artisanal mining is that these miners use mercury, and I mentioned earlier that there was a mercury law that allowed these miners to actually have access to mercury to use for these activities. And mercury is used for separation of the mineral from the dirt that is dark, right? So it makes it easy, and that's what this guy is doing here. And you find this woman trying to fetch the same water that has been polluted for cooking or for drinking. So that's the challenge, that most of these rural areas have access to water bodies that they would typically use for basic activities, and these water bodies are polluted as a result of artisanal mining activities. And not just the whole idea of digging and polluting the water, but then the usage of mercury, which is pretty much an issue for people living in these areas, and even for the people engaged in the activity itself. The other environmental cost, socio-environmental cost, is child labor and the precarious and unfair environment and working conditions that these miners are in. And you would think that a child should not be involved in any of these activities, but research has also shown that some of these children work with their parents on these sites. And so if your father is going and you have to tag along for a day, so you skip school if that's what brings money to home, they find that it's reasonable for them to take their children. I mean, ILO would not agree that that is legitimate for their parents to do that, but if it's something that their lives are dependent on, then it's a challenge to try to question why they do that. But I mean, there's a whole lot of that, and as a result of all of these environmental causes, and I've only listed just a few, there is a backlash, and I think even in South Africa there's also a backlash, and everywhere there is artisanal illegal mining, there is a backlash against people engaged in this activity. And in Ghana, you have all these social media campaigns that have actually emerged in recent times trying to discredit these activities and actually ban them entirely. And here I'm referring to the galamsey, which is the illegal aspect. So if you go to Twitter and other places, Facebook, you find all these hashtags being used to justify the ban of this kind of activity because of all the impact on the environment and on people's lives and society at large. What I find, though, is, when you talk about implementing laws or implementing any sort of regulation, we are made to believe that there is, this sort of tripartite linkage to some extent, where you have the government, you have industry, which in this case would typically be the diggers and to the exporters, so the whole value chain. And then you also have civil society on one hand, who would have to work with local communities to address some of these issues. But what I find in the context of Ghana, and why I think is a challenge is that domestic governance is not as clearly defined in this sense as we are made to believe, right? And that's just one example of implementation challenge. And I said that because if you look at a committee that has been established for small-scale mining by the act that I already referred to, you find a list of actors that are supposed to be part of this committee. You have the district chief executive, you have a member of the traditional council, which is basically the local authority, you have an officer from the Environmental Protection Agency. So these people are the key members of the committee who are supposed to deal with issues in this sector. But then, again, there's no mention of, and actually there's no recognition for small-scale miners. And even here, I'm not even talking about illegal mining, I'm talking about those that are regularized. There's no mention of them, there's no mention of civil society. So that's a real challenge, that if there's a legislation that is supposed to bring people together and makes no mention of these key stakeholders, I don't know how any regulation or any sort of implementation would happen without involving the people that are actually in the act itself. So that's one of the challenges. The other implementation challenge that I want to reflect on is just the role of traditional authorities, because what happens in the context of Ghana, I think, is the fact that you have 80% of land still being held by traditional authorities. And when I say being held, not that they have legal entitlement to it, because lots of these lands are under customary ownership, so there is no individual property rights per se on these. But I think what happens, though, is the challenge we're trying to work with traditional authorities in identifying the role that they play in this negotiation. The other thing is the use of aggression. So because people want to ban this activity, the government uses soldiers and police to target these miners, and they actually arrest them. And so as a result of that, it's difficult to bring them to table because they don't really trust that you're really doing that in good faith. Of course, there's also the cumbersome bureaucratic process where people would have to travel about 300 to 600 kilometers from wherever they are doing their activity to the capital city to get the legal license to mine. There's also the involvement of the Chinese. Foreign actors in general is not new to the context of Ghana, but I think in recent times there have been a surge in Chinese nationals working in these mining sites. And the reason why they are working there is that they provide most of the machinery that these miners use. And so as a result of that, they sort of claim some monopolies, and now they've actually been able to establish their own sites, even though they are not supposed to. So that's one of the challenges that we can face. So looking forward, I think There are quite a few ideas out there, so these are not new ideas that I just came up with. I think I'm just reflecting on some of these ideas that are there, but we've not really been able to implement them. One of them, which I think is a key one, and I had a video on it, so but I won't show that. I won't show it today. The slides will be available if you want to go look at the video. It's a very, I think it's a very simple technology. This example from Mozambique is it's a mine called CleanTech Mine, and it's privately owned. And what they do is, instead of using mercury, which is the main element that is used in most artisanal mining operations, they use magnets to separate the gold from the sand or the dirt, so the soil and the water and all of that. So that separation process is made easier. And again, because it's using magnets, and they get the magnets from used stereos, pretty much. So they don't even have to. It's not really an expensive technology. It's one of the easiest things that it can do. So as a result of that, it has an impact on the environment, and I think that is a key technology in terms of moving forward. And I think I've talked a lot about laws and regulations and stuff. But if one thing that you remember from this presentation, I think this is one of the ways that we could incrementally make a difference in how some of these activities impact the environment and impact sustainable development and the achievement of the goals as well. Stakeholder innovation has to happen as well. I've mentioned the neglect of key stakeholders in these activities, and I think you cannot deal with artisanal mining without talking to the miners. So that is a fundamental thing that needs to be done. Of course, bureaucratic innovation needs to be done as well, reducing the red tape to the extent that district assemblies and local authorities in some sense need to have some ability to grant people the license, even though it has to be streamlined in a way that people will still have to go to the cities to verify it at some point, but it has to be streamlined in a way that is not all centralized, and people would have to travel far to go get that. Of course, understanding the relationship of the local authorities in terms of their relationship with the people and to the land is also important. One last thing I would say is administrative and business linkage. I think it's actually very interesting. I don't know if companies would actually be open to this, but if they were, it would make a real difference that companies could actually use the expertise that they have. And I think earlier on we were talking about knowledge transfer. Corporations could use the expertise that they have to help these artisanal miners get on to mine in a very technologically savvy way, and in a way that does not impact the environment as much. That is not to say that large-scale miners don't impact the environment. They do, but I think they have more technologies to mitigate some of the impact that it could have on the environment. So there could be sort of linkages to learn from this if corporations are open to that. And the outcome of all of these innovations that I've talked about would be, of course, moving the miners from the fringes and moving them away from being in a marginalized position, and that would help in dealing with this sort of informal economy. It would increase the profitability of the activity itself as well, and it would also reduce the impact on the environment, which I think we are all interested in, and it would encourage these miners, hopefully, to regularize the activities. Even if they don't want to, I think the technology will still benefit them, and it would have a broader impact on the environment. And the last one, it would mediate the sort of conflict between the large-scale miners and the small-scale miners that has existed for so many years. And I think that would really help in addressing a lot of these issues. Thank you so much, and I look forward to questions.
So thank you, Nathan, for that interesting presentation. There's time to take a couple of questions now. If anybody is willing to ask, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Lucy Baker from the University of Sussex. I found your presentation really interesting, and I just wanted to ask, could you say a bit more about the conflict between small-scale and large-scale miners, and also you mentioned about Chinese involvement and Chinese companies providing a lot of the machines and machinery. Is that for the small-scale and or the large-scale mining companies? Thanks very much.
Okay, I'll go ahead and answer that question. So I'll deal with the Chinese issue first. I think what happens, though, is that if you saw one of the photos where this guy was using some sort of machine to what do you call it, to sort of sieve out the gold out of the dirt that is dug, right? So that is called the changfa, and it's I don't think that's the technical name for it, but it's a Chinese machinery. So Ghanaians have these workers have sort of used the term changfa for it. I think it has the name for it if you go and ask most of these people. So that machinery in particular comes from China, and so what used to happen was that the artisanal miners would actually go, those that have the money will go and buy it and bring it. But now what happens is they have individuals in the local areas who actually own these machinery, who are not involved in the activity, but they rent it out each day or per week or per month to these people that are involved in the activity. And some of these owners who were dwelling in the local areas were Chinese. And I don't know why it was so easy for them to indulge in this business from the start. So that was how they started. Now you have a lot of them that actually own their own mine. So because they have the machinery, right? Now, I guess they figure they might as well own their own thing and do their own thing and get the money out of it. So yeah, now they're actually much more involved. And also now with more trade and more partnerships, South-South cooperation happening between Ghana and China, that has really made it possible for Chinese to come into the country. And when they come, they do all sort of things, but also this is one area where they get into, and that's one of the reasons. In terms of the conflict, it is very historical. It's also because these local miners, first of all, feel the land did not really belong to anyone, and that's the customary aspect of it. But the constitutional aspect of it is that if a mine, if a portion of land has gold deposit or any sort of mineral deposit, it is mandated that it's under the authority of the president. And so the president can actually, in terms of the government of Ghana, could actually just lease it out to a corporation. But then when the corporation gets to the local area, they have to be able to get the social license to operate, which implies that you have to really live at peace with them, compensate them for losing their land, even though you would say that the land legally did not belong to them. There's this whole complex issue around land and customary versus modern practices. And so this has really created a conflict, and it's perpetuating itself.
Okay, thank you, Nathan.